Tonight, what I want to do is I want to introduce you to the concept. I want to define for you what biblical discipline is all about. Now, you're going to have a reading assignment. There's an appendix that's entitled Understanding Biblical Discipline. I want you to read from there. I'm going to just take 5, maybe 10 minutes and draw from that appendix and give you an introduction to this entire second half of Growing Kids God's Way. And then we're going to look at the standard. What is required for moms and dads? What is the standard? Now you, again, have plenty of things to be looking at. You have your outline in front of you. You can follow along with that. There are some key questions that you need to fill in. Let's get started right now. And let me start by just sharing a little bit about my own background. I grew up in a Christian home. You know, when I was growing up in a Christian home, I often heard that catchy phrase, spare the rod and spoil the child. To me, that seemed like a very universal phrase. It was quoted with divine authority by all adults in our church and must have meant something to everyone else. I knew what it meant to me, apparently. It was very obvious. But it was only after I became a parent myself that I really discovered the passage where that phrase originated. And I'll be honest with you, I was very surprised to find out that it was not Solomon who penned those words, but it was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin said, spare the rod, spoil the child, and he wrote that in Poor Richard's Almanac. That misunderstanding raises a serious question about biblical discipline. How many Christians base their disciplinary habits on secular perceptions of biblical truth? Unfortunately, I believe too many parents do exactly that. What the Bible exhorts parents to do is to discipline their children. Unfortunately, the English word discipline in our cultural practice does not match up to the biblical intent. For example, a child will disobey his mother and he will hear from her, Mommy needs to discipline you for that. Now that's a common but a misused application of the phrase and of the term. Today, we culturally define discipline to mean spanking and punishment. But true biblical discipline is one thing, and I want you to make note of this. It's heart training. It's training the child. It's getting to the heart of the child. That's what true biblical discipline is all about. When the Bible refers to child discipline, it implies moral training. Now listen, it includes training in personal self-control. That is control over our tongues, control over our actions, control over handling negative emotions, and making sound judgments for the child. Biblical discipline guides a child to an honest life. Biblical discipline teaches a child not to be offensive. Teaches a child to exercise righteous deeds. And most importantly, the effects of biblical discipline brings about the peaceable fruit of righteousness, according to Hebrews 12:11. Now, these activities sum up the goal of biblical discipline. To limit it, this concept of discipline to spanking and punishment, is to distort the original intent. I want to start out by helping you understand that when we talk about discipline, we are not talking about spanking. We are not talking about punishment. Those certainly are some elements involved. But biblical discipline is speaking to guiding the child through instruction, guiding the child through example. And there will be times when you guide the child through correction. Now, what is the goal of biblical discipline? Here I'm going to start out with a contrasting secular theorists. You see, secular theorists, to them, parenting is a matter of facilitating a child's natural way rather than actively directing the child's moral conscience. Reactive in nature, this non-directive approach seeks to control the child's environment in hopes of making the environment psychologically safe or psychologically healthy. The theory is rooted in the belief that children are born morally good, therefore comprehensive moral training is not really necessary. If outward conformity is required, attention then is often paid to controlling the child's circumstances and not necessarily controlling the child. Biblical discipline, now listen, biblical discipline is not the opposite. For the opposite is extreme, overindulgent, it's manipulative, and it's demanding. Biblical discipline is positively different. Understand this. Understand what you're getting involved in here. The primary consideration is the child's heart and intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic manipulation. We talk about biblical discipline, we're concerned about the heart of the child. We're concerned about motivating the child from intrinsic means, intrinsically, inside the child. We want the child to do right because it's right, not out of the fear of reproof. Now, we've covered this. If you need to review the early stages of parenting, go back to the conscience when we talked about this. We know that there's something about the heart we have to get to. The heart is the seat and center of all of life and behavior. We know that Psalms 139:23 tells us the heart is that portion of man that God looks on and searches. Matthew 12:34 and 35, Jesus said, all behavior and words have their origin in the heart. Proverbs 4:23 warns us that it is from the heart that the impressions of life, our young life, are molded and the issues of life flow out of. We know that Proverbs 6:17 says that the heart has the ability to devise wicked plans. There's something in the human heart, a child's heart, that we need to get to. And what is in that heart? Well, Proverbs 22:15 says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. Foolishness. The word foolishness means deceitfulness, trickery, deceit. It's a variant of the word folly. Folly means the following: stupid, empty, thick-headed, senseless, disobedient, and unwise. That's what folly means. Foolishness comes from folly. The Scriptures describe a fool as one who has reached adulthood, whose foolishness was never trained out of him. Now, I say that because I want you to understand what the Scriptures don't say. The Scriptures never call a child a fool. In Scripture, a child is never labeled a fool. A fool is one who has reached adulthood whose foolishness has never been trained out of them. Biblical parenting is a directive approach that works on taking the foolishness out of the heart of the child and replacing it with wisdom. That's what biblical discipline is all about. Now, there are some who would like to say in Proverbs 22:15 that childishness is bound up in the heart of the child. Unfortunately, the Hebrew text, the Hebrew language, will not allow for that translation. It is not childishness, it is in fact foolishness. Foolishness and childishness are two separate things. In order for you to understand how to apply biblical correction to a child, you first need to understand the actions of the child. Is the action foolishness or is the action childishness? You can become very abusive if you do not understand when your child is acting childish. Let me define this. Childishness is innocent immaturity. That's what childishness is. A child being a child, that's innocent immaturity. Do they make mistakes? Yes, they make mistakes. Foolishness is tied to rebellion, defiance, disobedience. It's all of the negative. It's the trickery of the heart. That's foolishness. When you're going to make an assessment of a child's behavior, one of the first things you have to do is ask yourself, is this childishness or is this foolishness? Now, two children can be doing exactly the same thing, and for one child it could be childishness, for another child it could be foolishness. I remember one of the favorite games that my children liked to play was hide and seek, popular game historically and certainly in the present. And I remember, too, one time while playing hide and seek outside, Amy came running into the house looking for a place to hide, a safe place to conceal herself. And as she was moving from spot to spot, her leg caught the cord of a lamp, pulled it down, and everything came to a halt with the crash of porcelain. Stopped right there. And we were sitting in that area, and what seemed like an eternity of time, her eyes focused on ours, we focused on hers, and she heard from her mother, it was an accident, but you should have been playing outside. Now, Amy didn't violate any rules. We didn't set any instructions down that she couldn't do this, couldn't be in the house. Her actions was childishness. The only rule she broke was maybe the rule of caution. What we did is we called all the children in, and we said to them, from this point on, there will be no playing in the house. When you're going to play hide and seek, you cannot play in the house. And so all those little heads nodded, and there was a sigh of relief, and they all went back outside to play. 20 minutes later, our youngest, Jennifer, comes running in the house looking for a place to hide. We caught up with her. Jennifer's action was foolishness. You see, Amy's was childishness. Jennifer's was foolishness. Jennifer chose to disobey in that moment of time. She received instruction. She acknowledged that she understood the instruction. and then she chose to disobey. The consequences meant nothing to her. So we dealt with Jennifer according to her foolishness. I bring this up because often parents will dismiss foolishness and call it childishness. Or they will overcorrect childishness when in fact the consequences for childishness are nothing like the consequences for foolishness. Amy's consequences, honey, you need to help clean that up. Amy's consequences were logical. There was no corporal type of punishment for Amy. Jennifer's consequences were much, much different. So please understand the difference. And parents, please understand this. This is critical in assessment. A child is not acting childish if the child is disobedient. The child is acting foolish. That's the thing. You cannot simply dismiss it. So he didn't obey, but it's only a child. That has nothing. Of course it's only a child. That's why you're the parent. You're supposed to take care of that foolishness. Let me move on a little bit more in this introduction. Talk about the heart or the mind. What are we after? As parents, what should be your focus? Is it the mind, the intellect, or should it be the heart of the child? You know, when studies in child development began to emerge as a separate anthropological discipline, popular opinion pretty much held that, in fact, a child's personality is fully formed by the age of 5. During times of this century, with different schools of thought, some have challenged that notion, feeling that no, personality is not really formed by 5, personality is formed much later. Towards the end of this century, there seems to be a consensus moving back to personality really is formed by the age of 5. Now, personally, we do not believe human personality can be completely formed by the age of 5. There are too many influences in the child's life, certainly after the age of 5, that will alter personality. I mean, the child may change schools, the child may lose a parent, the child may not make the cheerleading squad. Coming to Christ certainly is an indication where personality can be changed. Many things will happen after that age. Now, although personality is not formed by the age of 5, the developmental structures needed to advance the child's moral achievement are cast much earlier than that age. They have to be in place. They should be in place. This is where we believe the secular theorists have erred. Since they accept human reason as the basis of all morality, they consider intellectual stimulation to be the priority focus over moral development. This is pretty consistent with what we've seen in the last 20 years. There's a greater emphasis on the intellectual stimulation. Even though some have advocated, sending children to school a little bit later on, still, our society as a whole has put a greater emphasis on teaching a child his ABCs rather than teaching what is morally required in the moral standard. But quite the opposite is true. Moral education should not only be the priority of early training, but it's absolutely necessary for optimum intellectual achievement. Now, why is that? You want to jot this down. Because self-control is not an intellectual skill. Self-control is a moral one. So also is sitting. That's a moral skill. Focusing, that's a moral skill. Concentrating, that's a moral skill. They are moral skills borrowed in time by the intellect for academic advancement, academic achievement. This is quite obvious when you survey and scan what has happened educationally in the last 25, 30, 40, 50 years. Chuck Colson, in his book, Why American Doesn't Work, cites a very interesting statistic, which I think speaks to this very issue. When we were somewhat of a moral society, although Judeo-Christian being the only ethical system in the society, there was a cohesiveness, it was moral. The average vocabulary of children between the ages of 6 and 14 was 25,000 words. Today, as we move into the last decade of this century, the average vocabulary for children between the ages of 5 or 6 and 14 is 10,000 words. Part of that has to do with the fact that children go off to daycare so they don't have enough adult interaction, they don't learn the vocabulary. Much of it has to do, though, with the issue that we used to pursue the moral basis first. Morality, the virtues. Why? Because the self-control needed to sit, to obey. The self-controls needed to control the tongue. Self-controls needed to comply. Those are the self-controls that launched the child. And that takes us right back to the purpose of biblical discipline. You know what the purpose of biblical discipline is? Getting to the heart of your child, helping your child gain the self-control, helping your child become the governor over their own life so that you no longer are needed to govern it. They will be governed by moral principle. They could have all the moral principle that you could possibly stuff into their little hearts, into their little minds, if there's no self-control, if there's no self-discipline, if there's no concentration, if there are no focusing skills, all of that, those good things they receive in Sunday school and in home and in your devotions is going to mean absolutely nothing to the child. Because the vehicle to deliver it is self-control. And self-control training comes early. It also comes by knowing the standard, and that's where we're going to start. We have just finished 3 sessions of moral character training. In the first session, I spoke to you about respect for authority, especially as it relates to parental authority. In that particular session, we laid down the foundations for this session, which deals with the importance of parental authority and the need for obedience. We said a child will honor his parents. The best way to honor the parents when they're young, in the early years, is through obedience. And that's needed. Parental authority must be respected if you are to rightly train the child. And then you have to remember, you cannot start out by sacrificing your authority and the need for obedience and hope to gain control later on in the child's life. It just won't happen. In that lesson, we also stated the difference between obedience and submission. If you remember, obedience is a duty. Submission is something we do out of devotion. In the early years, you're working on duty. They are to obey because you're the mommy and daddy. They don't have the moral training. They do not have the moral capacity. They have more of a moral vacuum. Mommy and daddy then become the moral agents, helping the child understand what is right and what's wrong. So you have compliance that is needed. It's duty. But it's temporary. Again, I said this before, and I have to give this warning because what will end up happening with some of you devoted Growing Kids God's Way parents is you will have obedience. You will have the high quality of obedience. You will have first-time obedience. In fact, it works so well, you just continue along with it, and we're telling you that's a mistake. You have to transition the child in the middle years from obedience to submission. You have to transition him doing right because it's right, because I'm loyal to the family, and this is right, rather than out of the fear of reproof. You have to make the transition. But in the early years, it's duty and it's done because it has to be done. Now, Colossians 3:20, if someone questions why the children need to obey the parents, it's because God said so. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Colossians 3:21 says, fathers, do not exasperate your child, that they may lose heart. This is a fascinating 2 verses. One says, here is the standard. Come to obedience. By the way, this is not an option. This is not something that you just throw out to the child and ask them, would you like to obey? This is obedience, he's calling here. Hupakuo. What you have here is a conflict. To be obedient in all parental instructions will ultimately frustrate the child. You can frustrate the child. And yet, not to be obedient will violate the Lord's instruction. And so the Apostle Paul says, listen, the standard is obedience. But I also want to remind you, you could exasperate the child. So you're going to have to be very careful. These 2 verses produce what we call an antinomy. It's not a contradiction, it's not a paradox, but it's a seemingly apparent contradiction. Now, to help resolve that antinomy, we will give you information a little bit later in some of the other lessons to balance it out, how to prevent this from happening. We're going to give you some in this lesson, but when we present you the appeal process, especially in the middle years, you do not want to exasperate your children. You want to make obedience attractive. But for now, we're looking at the importance of child obeying his parents. We want to do it right. We do not want to frustrate the child. Remember, we're in the early years. That's going to be our focus for the next several sessions. Listen folks, everything that I'm going to give you is going to be tied back to what I've already presented in those foundational lessons. Please keep it all balanced. What I'm going to give you is not isolated from those first 10 lessons. It ties right in. You need couch time for this. You need to understand context. You need to understand what is the ethical principles, what are you after, the why behind your instructions. You need all of that. The first thing I want to give you is what are the characteristics of proper obedience? Jot this down, please. Number 1, we're talking about you giving instructions now to your children and their response. Here's what you should be looking at. It should be immediate. That's number one, immediate response. And if you want to write this in, the old cliche, which is so true, delayed obedience is disobedience. Delayed obedience is disobedience. It's immediate. Number two, it's without complaint. Pure obedience is without complaint. You know, you ask your child to do something. Oh, Mom, why? Now? Can't Dad do that? No, without complaint. Number three, without challenges. You know, that defiant attitude, that look. Without challenges. Why do I have to do that? Number four, it has to be complete obedience. Not partial, it has to be complete. In order to be pure obedience, it has to be complete obedience. Okay, so how do your children respond to you? When you call them, do they come immediately with a smile? Do they say, yes, Mommy? Yes, Daddy? Do they come without complaint, without challenge? What do you want now? When they follow through with what you've asked them to do, is it complete? Let me talk to you about how parents undermine the process of bringing their children to what we call first-time obedience, complete obedience, pure obedience. Let me start by asking you this question. Do you think it is the mark of a biblical parent to train a child not to respond to a parent's instruction the first time you give it? I mean, would that be representative of biblical training? To actually train the child not to respond when I call? Of course, we would say no, that would not be representative of a biblical thought. Yet it is amazing how many Christians, certainly non-Christians, do exactly that. They are training their children not to respond. Probably the most classic way, number one, is by being the famous threatening, repeating parent. You know that one. Mommy says, Mommy wants you to pick up your toys right now. Did you hear me? I'm not going to tell you again. Pick them up. See, first we start the repeat. Mommy's still sort of calm, collected, but very wishful. She's hopeful. Maybe today. I'm not telling you again. Then she'll move to a threat. Do I have to get the wooden spoon? I'll get it. And you will be sorry. Now pick them up. The child is still playing because the child has realized you don't mean it yet. So then the mother, now the blood pressure's up, the neck is beating. She's going to do something to this child. She goes to the kitchen, she comes back, and what does she do? She's got the wooden spoon in her hand, and she says, see this? And so she's threatening. See this? The child now makes the assessment. This is a very difficult thing for a child. You have to make the assessment. Okay, she has changed her voice tone. She looks angry enough. I see her eyes. Finally, I'm not going to take a chance. Yeah, okay, I'll obey now. And then the mother says, good, now I shouldn't have to tell you twice. That is the threatening, repeating parent. Folks, there are days when we are all threatening, repeating parents. Right? I mean, we're not talking perfection here. The question is, what are you characterized by? What are you characterized by? Are you characterized by being a threatening, repeating parent? If you are, then you're the type of parent that is undermining the child's requirement to first-time obedience. And when the child doesn't come to first-time obedience because of your training, ultimately, you are robbing them of being in a position to be blessed by God. Because God is not obligated to bless anything but obedience. And delayed obedience is not obedience. Why are you a threatening, repeating parent? Mother said to us, well, you know, if I don't ask them 3 times, they won't come. She said, in fact, I do this 1, 2, 3 thing, you know. I go, 1, if they don't come, they know. Warning. 2, I said, well, what happens when you get to 3? Oh, I never get to 3. What do you mean you never get to 3? She said, oh, I never get to 3. Because, see, they know what's going to happen if I get to 3. What will happen? Oh, they know what's going to happen. They don't dare disobey Mommy. My question is then, why don't you bring whatever's going to happen to 3 back to 1? That way you will be blessed, the child will be blessed, society will be blessed. Why do you want to be a threatening, repeating parent? Are you characterized? Are you afraid of conflict? Examine that and bring that before the Lord. Do you feel your child won't love you? Number 2 is the bribing parent is another way of undermining. We're going to talk about the bribing parent throughout the series, but the bribing parent is another way of undermining the importance of first-time obedience, because what you are doing is you are saying obedience is negotiable. You walk into the store, you say, honey, if you're good today in the store, Mom will buy you a candy. What are you saying to a child? You're saying, look, you give me good behavior, I give you candy. That's a bribe. Christian parents don't bribe their children. You know what bribing is? Bribing talks about a shrewd, devious manager, a manipulative manager. You're manipulating the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. You're appealing to their base natures. Candy, good? Be good, don't touch anything. What kind of training is that? Get up in the high chair, I'll give you candy. What kind of training is that? You don't bribe your children. That's not the carrot on the stick. The bribing parent undermines first-time obedience. Child ends up doing what is right. It's false obedience. They do it because there's something in it for me. In the end, that will destroy the parent-child relationship. That will destroy the child. And then number 3, which is another concern of ours, is the parent who neuters God. They neuter God. That is, they make God the God of mercy and grace and compassion without respecting His justice and His righteousness. You know, for many parents, showing compassion, it's often called grace and mercy, by the way. Showing compassion is made a greater virtue than righteous training, which requires judgment and justice. Some parents give out compassion in such distorted ways that it actually subverts God's standard of righteousness. But compassion is appropriately applied only when it's in harmony with the ethical goal. Compassion wrongly applied mocks justice, reduces the significance of Christ's crucifixion, which is both an act of compassion and justice. Parents have said to me, but I want to teach my children about God's grace. I want to teach them about God's mercy. And they say it very, very sincerely. That's why I don't require anything of them. That's why first-time obedience, I don't go to that standard, because I want them to see how compassionate God is. I want them to understand grace. Please listen to this. It is a very noble cause when a parent desires to teach their children about God's grace. But God's grace is absolutely meaningless if there is no understanding of justice. That's the key. Especially when you're talking with a 2- and 3-year-old who doesn't understand grace, mercy, or justice. If you have no understanding of the justice that had to be satisfied at the cross of Christ, you'll have no understanding of God's grace and His compassion. Letting your child get away with offensive behavior without applied consequences is not going to teach your child anything about God's grace, let alone about righteous behavior. Don't you be guilty of neutering God, of making Him something that He is not. That's what the Hebrews did when Moses was up getting the law, and they took that golden calf. They weren't fashioning some old Egyptian god. What they were in fact doing is fashioning their own God, the living God, but they were making Him something that He really wasn't. That's exactly what you do when you neuter God. It's idolatry, a type of idolatry. And those are some of the ways parents undermine their own training in God's standards. There's some reason why your children don't come to first-time obedience. It's because you haven't done it. Maybe you're a threatening, repeating parent. Maybe you're a bribing parent. Now it's time to stop. Here comes the standard. Well, how are you going to stop? Well, let me give you some principles first. Much of this really is going to come back to mom and dad. First of all, I want you to understand that first-time obedience is not a problem for a child. You want to write that down? That's good to write down. It's not a problem for the child. Put it up on the refrigerator magnet. This is not a problem for my child. This is a problem for me. My child has the easy part. He only has to respond. I have to initiate this. I have to, as a parent, initiate the standard. That's it. If you're going to initiate the standard, principle 1 says this. If you speak in a way which requires an answer or an action from your child, you should expect an immediate and complete response. You should expect an immediate and complete response. Now, we say that because this speaks to the parent's attitude and level of expectation. I mean, some of you probably would be very, very surprised if your child says, "Yes, Mommy, I'll do that." What? You can't do it yet. I have to repeat myself. First of all, it has to do with you. Do you expect this? Is this something that your child can do? We'll say, yes, your child can do that. We know your child can do that. We understand developmental levels. We know what your children can do. We also know what you parents don't do. First of all, you have to have an understanding, yes, my attitude is, I expect this. Why? Because my child can do it and it's right. Number two, when giving instructions to children, parents should say what you mean and mean what you say. Say what you mean what you say. I mean, that is so simple. I wonder why I would have to say that. The fact is that it's so simple that maybe that's the reason why parents don't understand. If you want your children to go to bed, for example, don't say to them, honey, you look tired. Would you like to go to bed? Because they're going to say, no. They're going to say, get in there. Why are you disobeying me? No. If you want to give them the option to stay up, that's fine. You have that prerogative as a parent. If you want them to go to bed, then say what you mean. Mommy wants you to go to bed now. This is time for bed. Brush your teeth. Put your jammies on. Hop in bed. Say what you mean what you say. Now I'm going to add to this principle too. Let's just park here for a moment. Children will respond to you according to your instructions. Let me give you a couple of different types of responses. One is called immediate obedience in time. We're talking about first-time obedience. One is called immediate obedience in time. That means now. Much of this deals with the early months, years. Also, it's health and safety. Immediate obedience in time, when you say, don't touch the television switch, you're not talking about don't touch it tomorrow, you're talking about it now. You're looking for immediate obedience in time. Someday my young parents, this may save your child's life. I think the most classic illustration that we're familiar with that came out of our class was one couple who took the time to train their child in first-time obedience. The father was working on the roof. He went in, was taking a shower. Son was outside, 2.5 years old. The ladder was still up. Mommy was in the kitchen. There was a strange silence. So she went out. Ryan, where are you? Heard nothing. Went out to the backyard. Ryan, where are you? And from the peak of the roof, standing there, is this 2.5-year-old who's saying, birds, Mommy. The mother said, voice changed, Ryan, listen now to Mommy. Sit down, do not move until we get there. You know what Ryan did? Sat down until the father came out and got him. Now, let's just think. What if this was your child? Before growing kids God's way. Would they have, with their feet going up, I don't want to? What would they have done? Would they try to get down the other side because they learned first-time obedience is not a requirement? Because they learned that your voice means nothing? Because they learned that you're a threatening, repeating parent and you don't mean it? How many times have we all seen the child going between two cars and you see cars coming on the street and the father's saying, come back, come back, come back. Stop. And the child learned to tune out the parent because instruction meant nothing. We've all heard too, I think, the missionary story. Carry this one step further. Walking back through the jungle with his son. They just stopped a moment of time. Something caught the father's eye and he said to his son, drop to your knees right now and crawl over to me immediately. And the son, just like that, as the poisonous snake was ready to strike the son. You see, someday this may save your child's life. There has to be training in urgency, training in your voice. But not everything in terms of instruction is going to be urgent, right? Certainly you don't want the child to have that sense of fear when you say, it's time to put away your toys. Oh, I'm going to die if I don't. So we get to instructional obedience and attitude, or what we call timely compliance. This is another way a child will respond. One is immediate obedience because there's an urgency, or the context requires immediate response. The second one, though, is timely compliance, maybe goal-oriented compliance. I want you to pick up all your trucks and all your little men and all the little Jeeps and cars, put them away. Well, that's a goal-oriented type of instruction. You give the child some time to think, okay, I'm going to put my trucks first and I put all my little men in. That's going to take time. You don't want your child reacting like, again, that something terrible is going to happen. You have to understand and look at the context of the situation. How about a 5-minute warning? This is very practical. You know how frustrated men you get? You're working on a project in the garage or you're working on your car. And your wife says, okay, dinner's on the table. And you say, come on, why didn't you give me 5 minutes? Because you're finishing this project, you're almost done, and come on, the food's getting hot, food's getting cold. What kind of example do you want to be to your kids anyway? Yeah. 5-minute warning. Let's say your children are playing a game. Do you know how exasperating it would be? Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Do you know how exasperating it would be to say to a child who's in the middle of a game or coming to the end of the game to say, okay, put the game away. Going to bed now. After all, we've learned about first-time obedience. You have to do it. Listen, give your children 5 minutes. Just say, honey, in 5 minutes, Mommy's going to ask you to put the game away. You're going to need to finish in 5 minutes. You know what that 5 minutes will do? It allows the child to emotionally prepare themselves to put the game away. They're watching television. Let's say that dinner's almost ready. Tell them. Children, in 5 minutes, you have your video on. Mommy's going to ask you to get ready for dinner. Giving that 5 minutes makes a big difference in how the child will respond. Do not tempt your children to sin. Do not force them into a situation where they have to choose the stronger pleasures of the flesh versus the instructions of Mommy and Daddy. Well, if you're going to say put the game away and it has to be put away completely, go ahead, give them the 5-minute warning. That's fine. I mean, not in every case, but as often as appropriate. And then principle 3 says this. Moving on now to the third principle. If I ask my child to do something and he does not respond assuming he heard me, my child's in sin. If I ask my child to do something, they disobey me the first time, they're in sin. If I ask my child the second time, assuming they heard me the first time, all things being equal, then I'm in sin. As the parent, I'm in sin. If I'm characterized by that, I'm in sin. Because I, the parent, am training my child in unrighteousness. I am reinforcing a young child, the heart of a child that does not have the full moral sense of right and wrong. I'm training that child to be disobedient. I'm training that child to be unrighteous. I'm in sin. It's something that we need to take to the Lord. You see, in all of this, there's a balance. Yes, you want first-time obedience. You want to look at the context. In our very first session, I talked to you about context. When the father said to little Nathan, Nathan, don't get out of bed, remember that? And I don't want you out of bed anymore, and I don't want you turning on that light switch. When his little brother fell out of bed in the middle of the night and Nathan got out of bed, turned on the light switch, was he disobeying or obeying his father? He was not disobeying his father because the context of the moment. The father never intended him to be in bed under all circumstances. So there are these balances. But you know the standard is first-time obedience, and my challenge to you is why not? Why not? Do you know how much work it is to be a threatening, repeating parent? Do you know how hard it is for a child to figure out when does she or he really mean business? First-time obedience is objective, not subjective for the child. It is the standard. It puts the child in a position to be blessed by God. It makes life easier. Go ahead, turn heads in your neighborhood, turn heads in your church. It was just like when I told you the story about Rick and his son Lukey coming back. The father was absolutely amazed. You mean you can have a child that will come the first time? Listen, and happy. Happy. And there's a reason why they'll be happy. And a verbal response too, folks, add this in. Verbal response, yes, Mommy, yes, Daddy. A verbal response lets the parents know the child heard you and is committing themselves to obedience or not committing themselves. Yes, Mommy. Yes, Daddy. There is something very beautiful about that. There is a child, you have a child here who becomes a blessing. Do you realize how much self-control it takes to demonstrate first-time obedience? Why do we want first-time obedience? Simply because we are the Christian parent and they're supposed to obey and we're the governors and they are our little children slaves? No, that's not it. First-time obedience is part of the learning structure. It's part of the self-control that is needed to launch them in life. The self-control that it takes to come the first time, to respond to the relationship, is the same self-control that's going to make them very successful. First-time obedience, folks, is not legalistic. It's a higher standard. If a friend says to you, oh, that's so legalistic, just think in your mind, no, Gary explained that. That's not legalism. A legalist rejects context. I don't reject context. But when I ask my child to come the first time, I expect him to come the first time. Why? Because it's right. And number two, there's no reason not to. Except for reasons of the flesh, something selfish. It's not legalism. Higher standards are not legalism. It may appear to be legalism for those who have lower standards, but it's not legalism. It's self-control training. Please listen again. We believe this. A child's feelings of acceptance and his sense of approval is directly related to the standards of behavior required by the parents. His sense of feeling loved by you, the joy of doing right, that sense of acceptance, that sense of approval. And by the way, this is the same for teachers. For you teachers who are here. It's the same thing for teachers. It's related to the required standards. Now that's true for all areas of character development, and it's especially true with first-time obedience. The child that is called to first-time obedience, whose parents affirm him in his obedience, will have a greater sense of parental approval than the one whose parents do not require the same, which would be permissive parenting. Or compare it to the child whose parents do require the same, but never affirm the child. That would be authoritarian parenting. When the higher standards are established, when a child meets those standards, when parents acknowledge the behavior, obedience becomes attractive and parental acceptance is verified. The higher the standard, the greater the confirmation, the greater the sense of approval in the heart of the child. The lower the standard, the weaker the sense of approval, and ultimately the weaker the parent-child relationship. There's a lot more to this, folks, than just making your kids look good. There are biblical reasons. Added to the biblical reasons as subpoints are developmental reasons. The standard is first-time obedience. It's something you can do, something you can have. We believe parents who fail to train their children in first-time obedience create more conflict in the parent-child relationship. Folks, for you who are coming in and some of this may be very new and you already have 3 or 4 or 5-year-old children, and you're saying, oh, this is overwhelming. All the problems I would be on these kids all day long. No, this is what is beautiful. This is what is so great about it. You can eliminate 50 to 60, 70% of all of your problems if you have first-time obedience. First-time obedience is like the wagon wheel. It's like the hub. When the hub is not fastened on, the wheel is not on tight. All the spokes are loose. Touch one spoke, everything goes. First-time obedience is like fastening on that hub. Everything's on. You will eliminate conflict because not everything's a challenge. The child then moves into an understanding the role that he has as a child. He moves in understanding of authority and submission. That it's not a threat on his life, but it's something that brings harmony to the family. Oh, first-time obedience. Go ahead. Bless your children. Bless your family. Bring them to first-time obedience. You say, how am I going to do that? Well, go home and say, okay. If you haven't been doing it, start. Apologize to the family. Apologize to the children. This is what we were doing. Mommy and Daddy were threatening repeating parents. But now, we have learned this is what is required. If you have older children, take them through this lesson. Just go through the lesson with them. The problem's not going to be with your child. Your child will love it. I mean, that may seem hard for you. You say, but I've been battling. You've been battling because you have, unintentionally maybe, you have rejected the standard. You can make life very, very nice for yourself and morally right. Help your child advance if you bring them to first-time obedience. We're going to talk more in our wrap-up session.
most difficult things for us over the next several weeks during the wrap-up sessions is we've got so much that we'd like to share, and just kind of keeping the thoughts concise and so that they'll be most helpful to you as a class. Tonight you learned the standard. Maybe it was a little different than what you were thinking you were going to hear, but there's so much really involved. And probably one of the first thoughts that I'd like to share with you as a parent in trying to come to the standard of first-time obedience, and something that frustrates that is when we become threatening, repeating parents. You know, first we start with the repeats and tell them once, we tell them twice, we tell them 3 times, and we begin to threaten them with all kinds of consequences. And unfortunately, as a parent, then we lose control. We can become abusive, really, with our words, which we don't want to do. For you moms, I know myself, when I started out my parenting, the last thing I ever wanted to do was raise my voice to my children. But when we don't understand the issue of first-time obedience, all of a sudden we find ourselves really with a level that is not representative of a godly mother and wife. And so this is one way to avoid becoming a screaming Mimi, by saying what you mean and mean what you say. There's just so many things, even I'm sure that the two of you are thinking as you're right in the thick of your parenting right now, with the issues of the traps that people fall in because they don't say what they mean.
Exactly. Gosh, like you said, so much floods my mind to say. But the frustration level parents feel by being threatening and repeating. You know, I think of myself. When you don't require this standard, you become very frustrated because you don't know when to toe the line, what to require. So you vacillate all the time, and then that gives the parent a very frustrating feeling. And certain times, like you said, become very verbally abusive because you're so frustrated with the situation. Like, didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you clear enough? And so what kind of stops that is by laying down the standard and then requiring a verbal response from your children. That is just so important, to require a verbal response. Not only does it, for you as the parent, assure that they have heard your instructions. When you have a verbal response from the child, they're more than likely in tune to what they have said, and usually proceed at that point to go and follow through with it. But it's not only important to get a verbal response, but have their eyes focused on you and their body. You know, they can't be, yes, Mom, like this type of thing.
Well, that's very easy for you to say. I'm sure our parents are sitting there thinking, fine, my children don't even listen to me, let alone get a verbal response. How do you begin the process?
Well, in our home, of course, we have 4 children, and so for our youngest, Brooke, it's much easier because she hears the other children respond, yes, Mommy, or yes, Daddy. But even with her, we like to play a game, and that is when we first start out on this venture, we sit them down and tell them what we're going to require of them. When Mommy calls you, or when Daddy calls you, we're going to require you to respond with yes, Mom, or yes, Dad. We play kind of a little game about it. We put one on one side of the room, and we go to the other side of the room and say, okay, now come to Daddy. And we hear, yes, Mommy, or yes, Daddy, and they come running to us. We really encourage them. In fact, encouragement is an important part of this. Because when they do respond correctly throughout the day, as they're first in the learning process particularly, you really need to encourage them. Say, hey, that was a great job. I really appreciate you saying that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
They do something that's very unique, and I want you to explain it for our parents. You require one of 2 responses. There's only 1 or 2 things they can say. Now, what are they?
It's either yes, Mom, or may I appeal.
May I appeal, which is something we're going to teach a little later on, but for now, just a summary.
Okay, yes, Mom would be the response most of the time. May I appeal is when they cannot follow through with the instructions you've given, and it's our format that they can tell you why they cannot follow through with the instructions given.
So that would eliminate the but Mom, or Dad, I can't, or this is unfair, I've got to. It just helps provide some structure verbally to keep everything together as it relates to their relationship to Mom and Dad as people in authority.
Especially in the disciplinarian phase, you want to keep those boundaries tight on the verbal freedoms with characterized good speaking, and they can then expand that a little bit and work into other areas. May I appeal, as well as coming to you in an appropriate way with an appropriate attitude.
Okay, that's good.
So I think maybe one thing for our parents to get a real grasp of this issue of first-time obedience, if you picture in your mind a wagon wheel, And first-time obedience is that hub of the wheel. And if it's not securely in place, then all the spokes kind of wobble. And if you think of all of those wobbly spokes being all the different issues of disobedience, because once more, we know what's in your mind, and right now you're thinking, oh, I'm going to be on this child all day long because there's all of these behaviors that are out of whack in our home. Once you establish first-time obedience, which initially is definitely going to include that verbal response, so many of those poor behaviors will begin to eliminate themselves because the children will learn they do mean what they say, they will follow through. There is security. They realize, boy, my parents are in control. And really, our children, they want that security. There's that inner tension with children, and even us as adults sometimes. We want those boundaries, and again, sometimes we don't want the boundaries. But that's what's best.
Honey, you've got to tell them the story of our little friend Nate from Atlanta, because that is such a classic illustration of first-time obedience and what the parents had to do to bring him to that point and the benefits of it.
We had done a parenting conference, shared the whole concept of first-time obedience, and Nate, who was 2.5 at the time, his parents realized that they were not requiring first-time obedience. And we were in the South, and one thing about our little Southern friends is they are very polite, even in their disobedience sometimes. So when Nate's mom would ask him something, he'd go, well, I don't want to, Mama. But after the conference, his parents thought, no, we need to get control of this. And so they started Monday morning. They were going to require first-time obedience with a verbal response. And Monday was a hard day for Nate. Tuesday got much better, and by Wednesday, the mom called me Thursday morning to relate all of this. She says, by Wednesday night, she says, we went to Wednesday evening church. We were getting ready to leave, and we called Nate, and we said, Nate, come to Mom. And he goes, I don't want right, Mama. And he turned himself around, and he came right with Mommy. So in 3 days' time, you know, the parents were able to get enough control, and Nate was much happier as a result. And even Dad noticed. I mean, we were talking about, you know, a happy kid anyway, but the dad, by Tuesday evening, he says, does this child seem even more happy to you than he has been? And Mom was feeling better. So there's, you know, when we're obedient to God's Word, there's all kinds of blessings.
And with those little toddlers, people think, well, they might not understand. It is a pretty easy thing to implement. When you call them, you know, go to wherever they are and say, Mommy has called you, pick them up, maybe even hold their little faces and say, Mommy is calling you. Say, yes, Mom, if they're capable. And then lead them to where you were and say, you need to come when I call. And working even a couple of days like that with a 2-year-old, often that's all it takes. And of course, as Eric said, the older they are, to sit down and explain and then remind them. Often when our children have, you know, slacked off or say, or whatever, we say, excuse me? And then it's, oh, yes, Mom. And then they respond the proper way. So you can even work on that as they're working on it. Give them a little bit of a grace period where you're working on it. Say, excuse me, what are we supposed to respond?
Children are smarter than we give them credit for.
Most definitely.
So many of us are quick to say, hey, come here, look at what Johnny's doing now. We're so excited about how intelligent he is. But then when it comes to giving commands or something, we say, well, I wonder if he really understands.
Well, that's classic, Eric. We have moms who ask us, they have a 18-month-old or 19 or 20-month-old, and they say, well, I just don't think my child will understand. One question came up like that, and Anne-Marie answered it so beautifully. She said, well, let me ask you, if you were in the kitchen and the child was playing in the living room with some blocks or whatever, and you said to your daughter, Mommy's got a cookie for you, what would happen? She said, oh, she would just come right in, and then she stopped and realized, I guess she does understand. She does understand.
Right. Selective hearing
Selective
that we all develop sometimes.
And getting back to what you had originally said about mean what you say and say what you mean, I've been with so many women who trap themselves by saying things they don't actually mean to do. We were at a birthday party, and a mother turned to her son and said, if I see that attitude again, we will just go home. And then she turned to me and she said, I don't want to go home. And she was caught in a bind because she had said something there that if she was going to build that trusting relationship, which we've talked so much about, she needed to keep her word and follow through with the consequences.
Great principle.
Yeah, and probably all she needs to do is follow through with it that one time, and it will eliminate the problem for a long period.
Once, right? You had that one situation in the store
Brittany.
with Brittany.
Oh, yes. My classic. We had met the Ezos when Brittany was about 2, so we had put in this first-time obedience principle into play when she was just over 2. She wasn't quite 2.5, and she was extremely verbal, so she could say, "Yes, Mommy," very easily. And I had asked her to get into the stroller, and there was no response. And she started to climb out again, and I put her back in the stroller, and I looked at her and I said, "You need to stay in that stroller." She kind of nodded her head, and at the time I took that as, okay, close enough. We're in the middle of the shopping center. I think I'll take that. And sure enough, I turned back around and she was getting out again. So I picked her up, and I decided, okay, Brittany, if you get out again, we are going to leave the store. I put her back one more time, and she got out. So I picked her up, and we marched toward the door. And as I was holding her in my arms, she screamed quite loudly. And it was very embarrassing because all these heads turned, and I thought, no, you really have to do what's right. So I kept walking. And as we got closer to the door, she realized that I was going to follow through with this. So then I start feeling this little pat on my back. And then I hear, "I love you, Mommy. I love you," and I thought, this child knows exactly what she's done. And she was just testing to see if, in fact, we were going to go home if she got out of the stroller again. And I can honestly say, in public, she never tried me again because she knew darn well that I was going to follow through.
That's great. That is great.
Yeah, there is, again, as we said, there is so much to share. And the thing is, it's not going to be that difficult for your children. As long as you, as mom and dad, present a united front and sit down and understand and explain, especially to your older children, what you're planning to do. And we have just volumes of illustrations, but another story that was told to us by a leader, the week after they had taught this lesson, everybody was reporting back, and one mom said, she said, it was so interesting. She says, I went home, explained to my children what was going to be required and consequences, and probably halfway through the week, she said, I was asking the kids to get ready for bed. And one of the children was just really dilly-dallying getting into the pajamas, and I was repeating myself. My 7-year-old son comes up to me and says, Mom, this is no time to get lazy. You need to follow through. And it's like, the kids are really asking for help.
Honey, you said it. There's no problem with first-time obedience for your children. We know the problem's going to be with the parent, because the parent has to change years of habits where the child does not. And the child just doesn't have a problem with it. You tell them what the standard is and they'll come to it. We could just get you parents to the standard, won't be any problem.
Yeah, requiring first-time obedience, requiring a verbal response gives you a lot more confidence as a parent.
It does.
Yeah.
You can step out and know exactly what to do and when to do it.
Right.
I'd like to move along a little bit with this too now, particularly for our parents that do have older children. They're going to sit down, they're going to explain, they're going to give the moral reason why, so that they understand the issue of obedience that's required from God's Word. But there's been something that I know we practiced in our own home, hadn't quite realized at the time the scripture that was involved. But in 1 Corinthians 10:13 it says, No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Well, this issue of a way of escape, how does that practically apply in our parenting? How can we help our children begin to understand that, yes, you may be tempted to disobey, you may find yourself in a situation that is not right. How do we help them to learn that way of escape?
By communication again. When we have disciplined our children or given them instruction and they have chosen to disobey us, always on our rebuke, we always share with them what could have done from the time they were very small. If they retaliated, let's say in anger and hit, well, what could you have done instead of hit the child for your toy back? Well, I always told them the response at first. Well, you could have come ask Mom for help. You could have asked the child, please, may I have it back? But we do not hit. And make it very clear that there's 2 or 3 things that could have been done to stay out of trouble, but they had chosen the incorrect way. And when talking to them about the incorrect way, to use things like self-control. You did not use patience in this area. You did not use self-control. And share with them what in the scriptures they have crossed the line with. And I think that really is helpful for them to see, and to also have them at the point, admit their guilt is very important to say, yes, I didn't use self-control. Do you think you used the wisest thing?
Mm-hmm.
No, I did not. Well, you can see there is a problem here then.
And that deals too, not only helping them to see what Scripture has to say about these issues, and that's a negative, but also from the positive when we see that they're gaining victory, say, boy, that was really a wise decision, and we can see that you are recognizing the preciousness of your brother or your sister. All of these things that we're teaching them, we need to reinforce with our verbal instructions and encouragement. Well,
don't even leave it. Don't even go anywhere yet. We still a couple more things.
Okay.
I want to pose a question about the standards for first-time obedience. What about protecting the dignity of the child, not manipulating the child into first-time obedience, or scaring the child, or embarrassing? You come across that in your counseling.
Well, this should be a concern to any of our parents listening, because we don't want to manipulate our children into obedience. We don't want to embarrass them into obedience. Little Johnny's jumping up on the bed with his friend, and Dad comes in and says, Johnny, you know we're not supposed to jump on the bed at our house. Mm-hmm. Immediately, that child is put in a position whether to go along with his peers or obey Dad. And we need to remember as parents to parent privately, to do it in a calm way, a way where we are confronting the child in a private way.
Now, I mean, how should the father handle that then? I mean, he doesn't accept jumping on the bed at home.
A little sign to Johnny to say, "Come here, Johnny,"
mm-hmm.
and reach down to Johnny and then talk to him.
Whisper.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Or to take him into another room. I mean, we can think of a lot of different ways, but sarcasm or rebuking them in public or smacking them or things like that takes away your children's dignity and takes away the trust factor between the two of you.
Well, as we said, there's a lot to talk about, and we probably could go on for weeks, but you've got enough